Time has come. Oops, we're a whole minute behind. So we will get started with the opening prayer. Heavenly Father, we again thank you for this morning. We thank you that we have some sunshine. We thank you for calling us together here to worship you and to be a body working together to help one another. We thank you for these scriptures and all these stories of the lives of so many people so that we can see how you worked in their lives to help us understand how you want to work in our lives as well. Let's pray that our hearts are open to understand. Pray in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we do have on the stand there was lesson 3. Just a reminder again, if you want outlines of previous lessons that you weren't here for, there are some on the back there, lesson 1 to lesson 2. Probably more useful than old lessons that are over. There is a document back there called Themes of the Book of Exodus, which you might find useful if you didn't pick one of those up last week. It's not something we'll be going over specifically in class, but it's all the major themes of the Book of Exodus that you might want to have to look at while we're studying it. So we left off at chapter 2, verse 10. So we're going to be picking up in verse 11. You can see on the handout there, for those that like to stick your thumb or a piece of paper in some place, we're going to be referring to a couple New Testament passages, Acts chapter 7, Hebrews chapter 11, in a minute as well. So Acts chapter 2, let's go back so we make sure we understand to verse 10. When the child grew older, she brought him, that was his mother, brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because I drew him out of the water. So that's where we left off after the whole story with the baskets by the Nile and all of that. So verse 11, one day, and let's just stop right there, because between he became her son in verse 10 and one day in verse 11, apparently 40 years have passed. So, therefore, I put there on the outline, 40 missing years. Right? So, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. He said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." And when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So we have this event after he had grown up, and this one story of him in Egypt, and then he flees to Midian. And again, I want to go back to, but there's 40 missing years of his lifetime here. And then I wanted to ask this question: what can we know about Moses' life, basically between ages 3 and 40? We can assume more or less that the first 3 years are the ones referred to by when he was being nursed by his mother. That would be more or less ordinary for years until weaning back in those days. So what can we know about Moses' life in those missing 40 years? Well, first of all, pretty much everything that we can think we know, including that it was 40 years, actually comes from these New Testament passages, Acts chapter 7 and Hebrews chapter 11. So we'll turn there and have a look at these verses, Acts 11, or Acts 7 and Hebrews 11. Acts 7, verse 22 through 25. And this is a really interesting passage which you should look at every once in a while. because we talk about rehearsing the gospel, and this is an excellent example of going all the way back, where Stephen, they ask him a simple question, and instead of simply answering the simple question, he goes back and tells the whole gospel story from the beginning, and goes through all of the major highlights of God working with people all the way up into the time of Christ. So this is right from the middle of that. He's giving a whole story of God working in the world from the beginning till Jesus. This is the segment right from the middle of that story. And he says, and Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. So there's several interesting things here. He was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Of course, we would expect this anyway. Right? That's something we would have assumed, whether anyone told us or not. He was being raised as the son of a daughter of Pharaoh. We talked about that last time. It doesn't necessarily mean he was right there in the household of the Pharaoh. It could have been in any one of a number of compounds with harems, for all we know. But still, it's going to be a place of relative influence, and the children there are going to be educated in schools and amidst other children of nobles and probably children of foreign politicians and various things of that nature. What would it mean to be instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians? You probably have some inkling from once upon a time in elementary school and whatnot. In fact, Egypt was probably the most advanced civilization of the ancient world. They would have been in the position to teach him several languages, since there is the language of Egypt and there were other peoples there, and they did extensive commerce with surrounding countries, and we have the historical documents to show that they were familiar with languages of these countries for business and political purposes. They were big into astronomy and math and geometry, concepts of economics, law, leadership in general, and of course, all of the arts of war would have been part of the education for someone in his position. So when it says, instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, we would assume that he had really a very extensive education in understanding things which really would have put him in good stead for being a leader of a people that were going to interact with other people. Josephus, historian who wrote a book called The Antiquities of the Jews, where he catalogs a number of things which were what you would call, I guess, the group wisdom of the history of the Jews from his time period. Actually has 4 sections in the Antiquities of the Jews, books 2 through 4. Stories about Moses are prominent. In his account, his father received a prophecy in a vision telling him that he was going to have a son who was going to be the deliverer of the Jews. He gives a name for which daughter of Pharaoh it was. This isn't really important for us, so I'm not even going to repeat it. And a number of details of his life, which of course can't be substantiated anywhere else, but nonetheless it's interesting that he thought he was able to give details of the life of Moses, including several important military campaigns that he supposedly led for the Egyptians against the Ethiopians. So all that would have been part of the lore of the Jews in those early centuries about Moses in the time of Egypt. Now, there's almost no chance that any of those things were actually historically documented, even at the time of Josephus. Mighty in word and deed was the other thing, right, that Stephen says about him. All the wisdom of the Egyptians and mighty in word and deed. And of course, we can see that in the accounts that we do have from the book of Exodus.
I have a question about that. There's so many people say that Moses had a speech impediment because he told God he was slow of speech, but when you read in Acts, like I've always thought about, it says he's mighty in words and deeds, and he was brought up. So was that something that he was just using as an excuse, and then people just erroneously came up with that idea that he had a speech impediment? Does it actually say that he had a physical speech impediment? I've heard that preached numerous times.
No, the only indication that he might have had a speech impediment is when he himself says that he is slow of speech, and yeah, there's more we can say about that when we get to that section. But ultimately, I'm going to come down on the side of he's just making things up at that point, because by the time we get to the end of all of his excuses, we see that they're excuses, right? Because when he runs out of excuses, he just says, "Send someone else." So we can't interpret anything that came before that as like, man, I really want to go, but he wants to present it that way. But when your final one is, no, just send someone else, it's hard to interpret the other things as anything but excuses. And again, there's every reason to think that rhetoric and public speaking and that kind of thing would have been part of his education. We know that he spoke in front of the people over and over and over again during his time leading the people. Now, of course, could he have spoken in front of the people all those times and had some sort of speech impediment? Of course, he might have. All right, so all the wisdom of the Egyptians, mighty in word and deed, tells us he was 40 when the story resumes in verse 11, which, when we add that together with other things that we're told later in the book of Exodus, allows us to see that his life is broken up into neat, convenient units of 40. 40 years of unknown life in Egypt, 40 years of almost unknown life as a shepherd in Midian, and then another 40 years of things that we actually have accounts of in the book of Exodus. It says also in Acts that it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. Let's compare that to what we actually have here in the book of Exodus. Actually, let's look at Hebrews first and then compare. Hebrews chapter 11, 24 through 28. Right in the middle of a long kind of section of talking about various people in the Old Testament and what they did by faith this, by faith that, going through lists of prominent characters, and we get to Moses in verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So there's interesting things here. Again, let's look at what we see in the book of Exodus and what we just read. Do we have evidence here in the scripture that by faith he had refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter and chose instead to be with his people? It doesn't quite say that explicitly, but when we look at the text here, and in verse 11, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. I think the implication here in the text is that the reason he's going out there is because he either is or has already decided or is at least thinking of identifying with them as people. The implication here, I think, is more than just that later on when he's writing the story, he knows that they were his people, but that all along he knows that they are his people. And the reason he is going to see more closely what's going on with them is because they are his people. So it leaves us again to speculate or take Hebrews' word for it that he had already decided, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life identifying as an Egyptian, but as a Hebrew. And we can interpret his intervention here as more than just a spur-of-the-moment action. I mean, it obviously has some of that character to it, regardless of the other things going on, but more than just a spur-of-the-moment thing, but kind of a result of him having decided that he wants to identify with his people. That's why he's out there. That's why he's watching them. That's why he intervenes for the mistreatment. Which brings up another question, which is not answered because of the 40 missing years. How does he know that he is a Hebrew? How does he identify as a Hebrew? How does he have understanding culturally of what it means to be a Hebrew? And a lot of times, if you read a commentary, it says that was the importance of him being raised by his mother. But I mean, come on! I mean, how much cultural identity do you absorb by the time you're 3? That puzzles me every time I read that, and you read it often in things. His early childhood with his mother, that's why he knew all about what it means to be a Hebrew. But his early childhood with his mother, we have no reason to think was any more than just long enough for him to no longer need to be nursed. And so, I mean, I think then, therefore, the implication is that he continued to have contact with them. Again, we know nothing about his 40 years, but we see who he is 40 years later. And I think the strong implication is that he maintained contact with his Hebrew family throughout the time he was living and being raised and being a part of the family of Pharaoh's daughter.
Is it also possible that Pharaoh's daughter, he questioned, and maybe Pharaoh's daughter told him about his heritage?
Well, certainly. That if he had continued contact with them, it almost had to be with her permission, unless, of course, again, we just don't know. 40 years is a long time. He could have lived from ages 3 to ages 18 only being raised as an Egyptian, and then through whatever means, because she told him or something else, became more aware of his heritage, and then gone back and started talking with them, and then gained all the education. There's many different ways in which it could have happened continuously from the time he was born, or after a little gap of time reconnecting with them, and there's no way that we can know. But it does seem that he must have had continual contact during his adult years.
But God had his hand on him even from the time he was a baby, because it said he was a goodly child.
Of course.
I think God
Yeah.
directed him.
Well, yes. I mean, we know that God has his hand on his life all the time, right? And God is directing them. But again, God could have directed his life in many different types of ways to make sure. So one thing we know, God is directing his life so that he knows that he's a Hebrew, so that he has the information that he needs, so that he has the beliefs that knows about God, what he needs to know to lead the people. And so we're just kind of speculating about how that could have come about. But again, it does seem like God arranged it so that he had contact with his people for whatever reason, because he snuck off from his Egyptian mother to learn about him, or because she just said, okay, great, fine, spend as much time with them as you want and learn, or because after he was a young adult, he went back to them. Whatever reason it was, certainly it's because God arranged it to be that way.
It's possible that he was circumcised and would have had questions why he was circumcised.
Right. That certainly is a legitimate issue. Also, a legitimate reason why she might have, in that other part of the story, opened up the basket and said, "Oh, look, a Hebrew child," because he was already 3 months old by then, and circumcision happens on the 8th day. Yes.
Seems like he had a firm grasp of the Hebrew language. Now, if that was taught in the Egyptian courts, possibly it was. They had to deal with Hebrews, but he was able to speak to those Hebrews after he killed that Egyptian soldier, whoever he was.
That's right, and there's a lot of unknowns there,
Yeah.
right? Did he already grow up learning how to speak a Hebrew language? I mean, of course, the Hebrew people that have been living for 400 years in Egypt could be expected to know the Egyptian languages or some sort of an Egyptian language as well, or at least a trade language which was known in common throughout the region. Certainly, Moses would have learned Egyptian and a common trade language from around the time, but we do have historical evidence that the Egyptians that were educated, at least some of them, did know some Canaan area languages as well for business purposes. So he could have also learned some of that during his education. And again, it seems very, very likely that he maintained some sort of a continuous connection with his family, and so could have learned Hebrew from them.
Is it plausible that the Jewish people were they were not intermarried in an ancestral sense, but they were very close knit racial people, that he would obviously even look physically different than the Egyptians that he grew up with.
Well, yeah, quite likely, yes.
And the way that these two said to him, or whoever, who made you a prince over us, like, it was almost like it was just a known thing who he was. He knew who he was. And it was almost like an outcast in a way.
Perhaps. Again, we don't know.
I'm not sure I know.
Right. If he's going to have continual contact with his family, then people generally in that community are going to know who he is and know that he's a Hebrew. So yeah, it seems most plausible that people in general knew that he was a Hebrew. He knew that he was a Hebrew, and it was a thing that people knew. I think seems most likely given the little snippets we have.
Scott, do you have any idea physical distinction between Hebrew and an Egyptian?
No, because there's a lot of moving in and out of peoples, even in the Egyptian ruling class during the 600 years or so that we know of as the dynastic periods. So no, I don't know if we could make if I could make any specific comments about how obviously different in facial feature a upper class Egyptian was to your Hebrew. All right, so let us move on to some things we actually do know about the life of Moses. So, verse 24. Well, I mean, I guess there's a couple other things we can say here. Here's some things we know about him. He saw this Hebrew being mistreated and killed the Egyptian. We don't know how much he had already decided he was going to give up a life of privilege in Egypt and identify with the Hebrews before he kills the Egyptian. We know that we're not going to condone him killing the Egyptian. We're going to condone him making claims on behalf of the abused Hebrew, but not necessarily the killing of the Egyptian. But also we see that this incident kind of forces his hand, so to speak, and so that he ends up leaving Egypt. So he goes to Midian and sits down by a well, which is where we left him. So we're going to verse 16 here. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs of water of their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. And when they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock." And he said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave him a son, and he called his name Gershom, and for he said, "I've been a sojourner in a foreign land." So he goes off to Midian, and he's going to meet the daughters of this guy referred to as the priest of Midian. And what do we know about him? Well, we know that sometimes he's called Reuel, and sometimes he's called Jethro, and there's even a third name thrown in there somewhere, which I didn't actually write down. Mostly those two names, but we shouldn't let that disturb us too much. I mean, after all, by now we should be familiar with the fact that many, if not most of the people we run into in our Old Testament have more than one name. They're sometimes called by. But it's also interesting to note that the Midianites are descendants of Abraham. So there are a couple interesting similarities here with Moses and the story of who? There are some similarities with Jacob, but then probably more similarities with the story of how Isaac ended up with a wife. Remember that Abraham sent his servant back to his own people to get a wife, and then the servant decided that the best way to follow and make sure he was following God was to make this request of God, right? Whoever offers to draw some water for me should be the one that you sent me for. But in that story, not only does she draw water for him, but then she waters all of his camels. So there's a couple interesting reflections there, that he ends up going back to the people of Abraham to get a wife. Not that that's the reason why he went, specifically to get a wife. And then also these daughters of Reuel offer, or he, instead of them, it's like an inverse of it. He waters their sheep, and a kind of inverse of Rebecca watering the camels of the servant of Abraham.
It also says in here, going back to what we talked about, the women said that an Egyptian drew the water for us and watered our flock. So he had the appearance of an Egyptian.
So they think he's an Egyptian, and that brings up an interesting question. I don't know how far we want to go to say, therefore, that facial features of Egyptians were the same. I guess it's just as likely that they're basing that upon what he's wearing, right? That he would have been wearing obviously identifiable Egyptian clothes, and maybe even had an Egyptian hairdo, which definitely would have been different than the way people in other surrounding areas wore their hair.
As nobility and fleeing for his life.
Well, yeah, because we say he drove off the shepherds, right? He probably had a sword. They probably didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And probably armor. Good chance of it.
Scott, it just always bothers me in like movies and fictional accounts that they always say that the Midianites are Ishmaelites, because they're not.
No, definitely not.
And it's back in Genesis 25 that Midian came from Keturah, an extra concubine that's like barely mentioned. And I don't know why, but it just always irritates me that they're like, oh, these are Ishmaelites. And I'm like, no, they're not.
No, in fact, the mother of the Midian is the wife that he marries after Sarah dies. So it's not even an extra concubine. It's a second wife that he marries after Sarah dies. He has some more children by, and the people of Midian are descendants of Abraham through that branch. You're right, definitely not through Ishmael. So it's interesting that there's kind of a special relationship there But which then sours later on for reasons that we have to come up much later in the story. But right now there isn't any reason for them not to be friendly, Hebrews and Midianites. And again, as I said, we have these reflections that he's getting away from the people of Abraham. Now, what does it mean when he says he's a priest of Midianite? It doesn't specifically say that means he's a priest of Yahweh, the actual God, as opposed to some other god made up by the Midianites in all of these years since Abraham. We do know for sure that later in the story, he is described as clearly being a believer in offering sacrifices to God. So there isn't any reason to think that that's not the case now. It's possible that he starts off as a priest of a false god and becomes a believer, but there's no reason to think that that's the case. There's no reason to think anything other than that he was always a priest of God. That here we have a separate stream of history in which knowledge of the true God was passed down from Abraham through the Midianite line. So we have someone here who is actually a priest of God outside of the connection with, through Jacob. And God's allowed to do that if he wants to.
I mean, these may be some of the other people that Jesus was referring to.
All right. We know that it's always been part of God's plan to have more people than just the descendants of Jacob. A special history of the descendants of Jacob, but it was never the case that those are the only people in the world that God was interested in. All right. So yeah, it's in Exodus chapter 18 when we know for sure that this then called Jethro is definitely a follower of God. Again, no reason to assume otherwise at this point. So if we go back to verse 23, where it says, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. You throw this in here, of course, to set up the actual call of Moses, which we're about to have, to go and deliver the people. Of course, it would be a mistake to think that God just suddenly remembered the people now here. This is, just reminding us and setting the stage that God does hear the cries of his people. Of course, he's heard the cries of his people for 400 years or so here, however many of those 400 years they were actually oppressed for. But his timing wasn't to deliver them until now, at least in part because of the desire to build them up into a people. Another aspect of the promise, to build them up into a people, and then to deliver them, and then to bring them into the land. So we establish that this is the God that there's a reminder of the covenants of the people, and that God is faithful to the covenants he had with his people. So when it says he remembered his covenant, of course we will not interpret this as, oh man, for 400 years I forgot about this covenant. It's a good thing the people cried out and reminded me. No, remembering the covenant here is more in the order of the action. He's remembering the covenant in that now he's fulfilling it, obviously not in his having ever forgotten about the covenant. So, which brings us to chapter 3, and another 40 years jump ahead, basically. So we had 40 years where all we know is that he was being raised, and then we have 40 years where all we find out was that he married a Midianite and had at least one child. That's all we know about him. And we find out here in verse 1, I guess also, it says, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. So we know that he has spent this 40 years as a shepherd, which the Midianites, as far as we know, were always nomadic shepherding peoples. So that's what he's been doing for these 40 years. So I'm just going to pause there before we look at the burning bush and ask us to reflect on this. What's the purpose of this 40 years? Again, if we asked it this way, we had the implication. What was the purpose of the first 40 years?
Leadership training.
All right, so that's, we can summarize it easily that way, right? Leadership training, all those things he learned, all the wisdom of the Egyptians that he would have learned was in many, many ways leadership training. What's the purpose of this 40 years?
Maybe he's learning to be a shepherd in the sense that he was a shepherd, and maybe that's going to come into play for
Okay, good. We know that that God likes to look at the concept of leadership amongst his people as the idea of a shepherd. And so here we have 40 years of being a shepherd, which is a whole different kind of leadership than the leadership he might have learned in the schools, or if he really were a military commander, as Josephus said, amongst the Egyptians.
Learning to wait on God in his time.
Yeah.
Ahead of himself with killing the 2 Egyptians.
Exactly. What is one thing we know about him when he's 40 years old? That he's a bit impetuous. We have that one story of his whole early childhood, and that's the one thing we know about him for sure. He seems to be a bit impetuous. Now he's got 40 years to just kind of learn the patience of being a shepherd.
Being that Jethro here is referred to as a priest of Midian yet again, he probably learned more about the worship of God and just kind of the routine and a different type of leadership too, whether it's from the priest or from other leaders of the Midianites, leading people in a nomadic lifestyle, that he was going to need to know how to do that, learn where the wells were, all the, like, how you regulate and manage a bunch of people and a bunch of flocks as you're moving from one destination to another.
Exactly. I think about how different of a life that he is being called to lead the people in than his life, most likely in a city in Egypt. Completely different cultural aspect of leading a people in the wilderness, which he's going to be more prepared for because of his time shepherding. And I think it is a really interesting question. How much did he learn about God from Jethro, who was a priest of God? I mean, how did God reveal himself to Jethro? What interesting insights did Jethro have because of however God had revealed himself to Jethro to share? We don't know, but we do know he spent all of this time with someone who is described as a priest of God.
It seems to me, by getting older, you just naturally got more mature, too, as far as the way he thought, the way he felt, the way he looked upon things, and got more grounded all the way around, just as far as the way he led his life and everything.
All right, yeah, so a whole 40 more years of maturity and seeing life from different perspectives.
Where is Midian, by the way?
That's why it's that Midianites were mostly known as being a nomadic people. So in none of the ancient maps is there a place called Midian to know exactly where they were. But some place around where Horeb/Sinai is, because that's where his flocks are at the particular time when he sees. So somewhere around there.
Scott, when the 2 Egyptians were fighting and Moses stepped in there, or not Egyptians, the 2 Israelites, apparently there was some animosity there. Could it have just been, from a human standpoint, it took 40 years for the Israelites to be ready for a deliverer, more so Moses being brought to that point?
I think that's also perfectly legitimate. Yes, maybe having known him as some sort of Egyptian nobility, whether he was really directly a part of Pharaoh's household or not, might have made it more difficult for them to accept him than him coming in 40 years later. That's clearly possible. It's hard to, I think, make a lot of claims based upon that one story, because here are people in the heat of the moment fighting against each other, and one guy gets called out for being in the wrong. I mean, how many people respond charitably when that happens, regardless of what people in general might have thought otherwise? So I don't know if we can assume that all of that represented a typical Hebrew feeling toward him or not, but maybe. It's possible that helped in the relationship with the people to be separated from his time of living as an Egyptian. Any other thoughts there? So again, what are we seeing? We're seeing God's hand in the life of Moses. He's preparing him in many different ways to be this very special leader of the people. So again, prepared in education and academics, so to speak, to be the person who writes down all of these stories and the law and all that kind of stuff, but in many other ways to be the leader of a nomadic people through the ways that God is orchestrating his life to be. So it says here in again in verse 1 of chapter 3 that he was leading a flock on the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Horeb and Sinai are almost interchangeable terms. Some people speculate that maybe the area was called Horeb and the specific mountain was called Sinai. So sometimes the mountain, because it's in that area, is called Horeb, and sometimes Sinai. Or different peoples have different names for the same mountain. That's a thing that happens. Was it already called the mountain of God then? Maybe. It's equally, maybe possibly more possible that he's just calling it that now because that's what it had become known as by the time he's writing the story. But there we get to in verse 2, the angel of the Lord appeared. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. He said, Here I am. And then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So this call of Moses and this answer of here I am is, if we study this word throughout the history of the Old Testament, a phrase which implies more than just acknowledging that I'm standing here. It's a reply that acknowledges I am here and ready to listen. There's an implication of submission and readiness to obey in that phrase that's translated here I am. In fact, we see this in several important instances in the Old Testament. We have this with Abraham, specifically in the story when God comes to him to tell him to sacrifice Isaac. We have an instance of this same thing. Abraham, here I am. And then we see the rest of the story indicates to us his willingness to submit in obedience, no matter what God asks of him. We see this with Jacob when God comes to him in a dream. Again, Jacob, here I am. We see it here with Moses in the burning bush. We see it later in the story with the calling of Samuel to be a prophet. Again, his name being called Samuel. Here I am, and then God calls him, establishes him as a prophet, and again we see it with Isaiah when he is called to be a prophet. God calls his name Isaiah. Here I am, again indicating the willingness to obey and become the instrument of God in all of those stories. That's how we want to see it in that context here, when the call from the bush as Moses, and the response is, "Here I am." So, and God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and therefore the God of the covenant made to and reaffirmed, made to Abraham and reaffirmed to Isaac and Jacob, which of course is the point of this particular calling of Moses. Verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you when you have brought the people out of Egypt. You shall serve God on this mountain. So here we have this call of Moses to be the instrument of God in fulfilling this part of the promises, bringing them, the beginning of the bringing of them to the promised land. Now, I get to pause here and ask you this question, if you've ever reflected upon this. How is it that the Hebrew people, after 400 years, have any concept of themselves as the Hebrew people and have any understanding of God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? It's not like they had any scriptures to read. Right? They don't have a law. That hasn't happened yet. They don't have these books that were written down by Moses, before Moses. How is it that they have an identity of being a people? And how is it that they're organizing their lives as being the people of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob?
Do you think that possibly some of it had to do with their passing this down from generation to generation, from father to son, from mother to daughter, down through the years, as to their tradition and their heritage?
Really, there isn't really any other explanation, right? If they're going to have an identity as a people, which they clearly do, it has to be because it's being passed down as oral traditions through families and through elders. We don't want to forget about that. We know everything we know about people's living at this particular time and place, as they're going to be tribal people. They're going to have not just a father and a family, but elders and a clan, and it's going to be an important part of that role to make sure that the stories of identity are passed down and remembered among the people. That's the way these things work in pre-literate societies in general all around the world. It always has been that's the way identity is. So it's passed down through stories that are important for the identity of a people. And in this case, of course, especially the stories of God coming to Abraham, of God coming to Isaac, of God coming to Jacob. That would have been the essence of the stories, which would have to be passed down from father to son and from elders to clan, with the official storytellers more than likely to tell the stories And of course, we don't have any indication of it here, but every other indication we have all throughout the Old Testament, including going all the way back to Cain and Abel and disagreements over a proper sacrifice, through the existence of a person called the priest of Midian that appears out of nowhere, that God is part of his standard operating procedure seems to have been to relate to people in one way or another, the proper ways of worshiping him and offering sacrifice and establishing some people to do that, even before it gets totally codified in the law that's given at Sinai. There's every reason to suppose that God would be doing this among his people in some way or another throughout all this history, just because it doesn't tell us. Or, again, the scripture never tells us that God told Cain and Abel how they should have sacrificed, but later on we find out that part of the problem was he did it wrong. You can't do it wrong if it hasn't been laid out how to do it right. So we have those two ideas here, that God somehow is working with the people and making sure there's people who understand what it means to worship him. And of course, in this type of society, in this type of history, the idea of passing down the foundational stories would be part of what it means to be a people.
I think it's interesting too, I don't know if it shows it's cowardice or if it's just something, that he says, who am I to do this, when he was brought up, because God brought him up, just kind of like, well, who am I to bring these people out of Egypt, when he was part of them, and,
I know, it is an interesting comment, and again, we don't know exactly what to make of it right now, but by the time we get to the end of the story, we know what's going on here. If this was all we had, we might be tempted to say, oh, look, he is a man of humility, that's good, and all that. So by the time we get to the end of the story, it's sounding a little bit more like false humility than real humility. Yeah, you're right. We might almost expect God's answer to him to be, what do you think I had you raised by Egyptians for? Who am I to lead them out? Who else did I provide this perfect opportunity to be able to interact with both people? But instead of saying that to him, he says something more interesting and important for us always to hang on to, and say, I will be with you. Who am I to go and do this? I will be with you. Is probably the most important personal reflection to take out of this, right? Every time we study scriptures, we want to understand what it reveals about God and what he's doing. And of course, that's the point of God creating the story, let alone preserving it for us out of all the time. But we also want to ask ourselves, how can we take something from this story to help us live our lives for Christ? And this is probably one of the most practical things in the whole wide story, right? That if God is asking something of you, it might very well naturally come to you to think, wait, me to do this? And you might even be more justified than Moses was in wondering what it is about you that makes you suitable for a task that seems that God is calling to. But certainly, we can always take hold. Well, if God is appointing us a task, if God is leading us in a direction, then the one most important thing that goes along with that is that God is with us. Who am I to do this? Well, I will be with you. That's way more important than who you are, right? I will be with you. Think about that, the nature of the slight dissonance there between the question and the answer. Who am I to do this? I will be with you. It doesn't make any difference who you are. I will be with you. Or look at that. Who are you? You're the one that I will be with to do this. That's who you are for leading the people. So I list that there as the first objection. We get five. We get five altogether, but only two for today. Because if we do read just a couple more verses, think we ended in verse 12. I've lost my place here. Oh, there it is. And then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? I put a little question mark there under second objection for you because it doesn't sound like an objection, but I think it is when we look at the context here. Because why would he be asking a question like that? If you think again, if he comes and he says, it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what more is there to say to these people at this particular time, especially if we reflect upon this, and we aren't specifically told this until chapter 6, but in chapter 6 we're specifically told God didn't reveal himself to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob by a name. So why is he asking, what if they ask me what his name is? It's like, they're not asking that. There's nothing about their history that's going to make them want to ask that. The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is who he is to the Hebrew people. So I think, again, we're going to want to interpret this as the second objection, as making up reasons to find a problem, because he's a little bit scared, I guess, to go back to Egypt, or he just doesn't want to uproot 40 years of life to go back to Egypt. But God doesn't say all those things to Moses. He doesn't say, what do you mean, name? I don't go by a name. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, I am who I am. And then he says, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, which, if you notice the all caps there in your version of the Bible, means that he is using the name which is based upon the word I am, which we often, transliterate as Yahweh. He said, I am who I am, and then he's basically saying, the I am, the God of your fathers, God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, God of Jacob has sent me to you, and then establishing this, and this is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all the generations. So establishing that the I am is to be his name now, aside from, of course, continuously repeating that he is also the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that he should tell them that. I don't want you to miss that too. He already told them, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You should go to them and say, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has sent me. What if they ask me your name? I am. You can tell them, the I am, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has sent you. And then he repeats that again, right? So there's this repeated emphasis on reminding them, regardless of the fact that he is also going to establish a name, to keep reminding them, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why is that so important?
He's the one they're the ones that he gave the covenant to.
Exactly. It reminds them of the covenant, and that's crucial to all of this. But I'll just say this, and we'll pick up here again next time. I have a few more things to say here about I am and this, and then we'll continue with the rest of the objections. It's the source of their faith, right? It's really important to remind ourselves all the time that faith is always based upon something that we know about the person who has made a promise. In this case, why do we know that God is trustworthy? Look what he did for Abraham. Why do we know that God is trustworthy? Look what he did for Isaac. Why do we know that God is trustworthy? Look what he did for Jacob. And of course, by implication, also the story of Joseph, even though he stops with Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. They know these stories. They know what God has done. They know the stories of God being faithful in the past. That's going to be their source of faith for the present, knowing that God has been faithful in the past, which of course is also why we're reading the book of Exodus, right? It hasn't changed since then. This is why we have faith, because we know who God is, a God who is faithful, because we know how he has interacted with all of these people in the past, amongst all the other things in the New Testament, in our own lives, and the stories of other people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. the end for today.